Do you think it even understands a damn word we're saying?" Richard Sterling didn't bother to lower his voice, his smirk cutting across the vast walnut table like a shard of glass. His CFO, Blake Harrison, let out a short, guttural chuckle. "Doubt it, but hey, $1 billion buyout for a silent little geisha automaton? I'll sign that deal in my sleep. Who cares if it can talk, as long as its signature works?" That's how the goddamn night started. And if you think that's bad, you have no idea where this is going. This story is about to take a turn so sharp, it'll give you whiplash. So, before we get into the blood and guts of what happened in that penthouse dining room, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, ring the bell, and get ready. Because we tell stories about the people you ignore, the ones you write off, the ones who are about to burn your whole world down. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single one. The deal on the table was for $900 million. A hostile takeover disguised as a partnership set in the heart of New York City. The restaurant was called The Apex, a name as arrogant as its clientele. It was perched on the 80th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the Manhattan skyline, a glass needle threaded with gold. The view was a dizzying, glittering carpet of a city that never slept, a panorama built on pure, uncut ambition. But what was supposed to be a landmark deal between two tech giants was already curdling into something rotten. It was a silent, undeclared war fought with glances, with condescension, and with the suffocating weight of prejudice. At one end of this polished battleground sat Akira Tanaka, the Japanese tech magnate who had forged her empire, Kirin Robotics, from nothing but code and sheer will. Her silence tonight wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a form of discipline so profound, the men across from her couldn't even comprehend it. She had chosen not to speak a word of English. Not because she couldn't. She was more fluent than they could ever imagine. But because she wouldn't. It was her shield, her scalpel, her way of seeing them for who they truly were when they thought no one was watching. And behind her, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, moved Maya Jordan. A young black woman, 26 years old, with a dancer's posture and eyes that missed nothing. To the men at the table, she was just a waitress. A pair of hands meant to refill their glasses of ridiculously expensive whiskey. She was invisible. But she wasn't just pouring drinks. She was absorbing everything. Every disgusting word, every microaggressive sneer, every insult whispered with the confidence of men who believe their privilege makes them soundproof. She saw the smirks, the lazy snap of fingers to get her attention, the thinly veiled racial slurs, the complete dismissal of Akira Tanaka as anything more than an exotic prop on their path to total domination. What happened next wasn't just a business negotiation falling apart. It was a goddamn revolution served on a silver platter. This isn't just a story about a corporate power play. This is a black story. It's a story about being underestimated, about being overlooked, and about the devastating power that builds in the silence of women who have been told their entire lives to be quiet. Because when Maya Jordan finally opened her mouth, she didn't just translate a few words. She flipped the entire goddamn room and their entire world upside down. Stay with us. You're going to want to hear every last word of this. The Apex wasn't a restaurant. It was a statement of power. To even get a reservation in one of its private rooms, you had to have a net worth that could buy a small country. The chandeliers didn't just hang. They dripped with thousands of hand-cut crystals, cascading like frozen waterfalls of light. The marble floors were so polished they reflected the dim, amber glow of the room like a dark, still lake. And that view, that 360-degree spectacle of New York City, was designed to make you feel like a king, a god, perched atop the world you were about to conquer. Inside the private room, the air was thick with the scent of money and arrogance. Rich, dark mahogany panels lined the walls, absorbing sound and creating an atmosphere of conspiratorial exclusivity. A long, curved table of polished walnut reflected the flickering candlelight, making the faces around it seem like they were floating in darkness. The smells of seared foie gras, truffle oil, and $100-a-glass bourbon mingled in the air, a perfume of pure decadence. At the far end of the table sat Richard Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a former Ivy League athlete, crammed into a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maya's entire year of tuition. His hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed silver blonde, and his smile, which he used like a weapon, was perfectly timed, perfectly white, and completely empty. He was a man who had never been told no, a man who expected the world to bend to his will. Beside him slouched Blake Harrison, the CFO. He was younger, with a sharper, hungrier look in his eyes. His suit was a shade darker, his watch a degree flashier. If Richard was the king who gave the orders, Blake was the gleeful executioner who sharpened the axe. They were predators in bespoke suits, their minds constantly calculating, their patience tissue-thin, and their belief in their own superiority absolute. And across from them sat the woman they thought was their prey, Akira Tanaka, the billionaire founder and CEO of Kirin Robotics, the Tokyo-based visionary who had pioneered the world's most advanced surgical robotics and neural interface technologies. But tonight, she was an enigma wrapped in silence. Her silver hair was pinned back in a severe, elegant knot. Her dress was a deep, midnight blue silk that moved like liquid when she breathed. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. Her presence alone was her statement. Calm, unreadable, and utterly immovable. She hadn't uttered a single syllable. Her aide, a quiet man seated just behind her, offered brief, soft-spoken translations when absolutely necessary, but for the most part, Akira simply listened. Her silence was a vacuum, and it was making the sharks across the table twitch with irritation. And then there was Maya, the invisible one. She slipped between the table and the service cart, her movements economical and silent. She topped off water glasses, replaced silverware, cleared plates with the quiet efficiency of a ghost. Her name wasn't on any list. Her opinion wasn't requested. Her voice, they assumed, didn't exist. But her eyes were recording everything. She watched Richard's condescending smile as he explained basic market principles to a woman who had built an empire. She saw Blake's restless leg bouncing under the table, a jackhammer of impatience. And she watched Akira Tanaka, stoic, regal, holding her ground with quiet dignity in a room that was designed, from its very foundation, to make her feel small and foreign. The battle lines hadn't just been drawn. They were etched in stone. The room might have looked like the pinnacle of luxury, but beneath the veneer of civility, something cold and ugly was simmering. This wasn't a dinner. This was an interrogation. This was a test. And none of them, especially not the two men who thought they were in charge, had any idea who was actually being tested. The first toast was a monument to awkwardness. Richard lifted his glass of bourbon, his posture radiating the unearned confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of every room. "To global partnerships," he boomed, his voice a little too loud, a little too hearty, "and to a future where science knows no borders." He flashed his predatory smile, as if he'd just delivered a line that would be quoted in business journals for years to come. Akira simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. She lifted her glass of water, held it for a moment in the candlelight, and took a small, measured sip. There were no words. There was no request for translation. Blake leaned over to Richard, his whisper a stage whisper, loud enough for half the room to hear. Was that a yes or just a polite little bow? I can never tell. He didn't even try to hide his contempt. Akira murmured something in Japanese to her aide. The man, whose face remained a mask of professional neutrality, turned to the table. Ms. Tanaka appreciates the sentiment, he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. That was it, and that set the pattern for the next hour. Richard would launch into long, animated monologues about the transformative potential and synergistic alignment of merging Kirin Robotics' groundbreaking surgical AI with Sterling Dynamics' vast global distribution network. He threw around numbers in the hundreds of millions. He outlined aggressive timelines. He gestured with his hands as if he were conducting an orchestra that only he could hear. And Akira would respond with a single, short phrase. Quiet, precise. Her aide would translate it into a single, neutral sentence. Always one sentence. Always polite. Always giving away nothing. Blake's paper-thin patience was the first to shred. He leaned in close to Richard, his voice a low growl of frustration. Are we seriously trying to negotiate with a statue? This is fucking insane, Richard. Richard forced his smile to remain in place, though Maya could see the strain at the corners of his eyes. It's cultural, Blake, he whispered back, his voice tight. She's playing the long game, the inscrutable Japanese thing. Just be patient. We wear her down. But Blake wasn't built for patience. He was a creature of immediate gratification. He snapped his fingers in Maya's direction without even bothering to look at her. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a whip. Hey, sweetheart. More of that Yamazaki. We're gonna need the whole damn bottle to get through this. Maya felt the sting of it, sharp and immediate. It wasn't the request. It was the tone. It was the unearned, slimy familiarity of sweetheart, a word that, from his lips, felt less like a term of endearment and more like a leash. She approached the table, her hands perfectly steady, as she poured the golden liquid into his glass. She said nothing, but her eyes were watching, her mind was recording. Later, after the aide had translated yet another one of Akira's impeccably measured responses, Blake leaned back in his chair, making a show of rolling his eyes toward the crystal chandelier. You know, he announced to the room, his voice dripping with sarcasm, we could probably just replace her with one of her own robots. We'd probably get more interaction out of it. Richard let out a forced chuckle. Maya saw Akira's face. It remained a mask of calm, but something shifted deep in her eyes. A flicker. A wound being registered, catalogued, and then filed away behind a wall of impenetrable composure. They weren't speaking to her anymore. They were speaking over her, around her, through her, as if she were a piece of furniture they had to navigate. They saw a language barrier, but they were completely blind to what that barrier was saying about them. To these men, Akira Tanaka was a problem to be solved, a variable to be controlled, a name on a contract they were determined to acquire. But to Maya, as she moved silently along the edges of the room, Akira looked like something else entirely. She looked like a mirror reflecting 1,000 other moments of being overlooked, of being underestimated, of having to fight a quiet, draining war that no one else could see. Maya could feel the tension in the room coiling tighter and tighter. The air wasn't just getting colder. It was beginning to crack. Maya Jordan had learned the art of disappearing at a young age. It wasn't a lesson taught in a classroom, but one absorbed through 1,000 tiny cuts. It was learned in gifted programs where she was the only black girl, her intelligence always treated as a surprising anomaly. It was learned in high-end stores where her presence was immediately clocked, not as a customer, but as a potential threat, trailed by suspicious eyes. It was learned in job interviews where the smiles were wide and the promises were bright, but the follow-up call never came. In a place like the Apex, invisibility was part of the job description. It was drilled into them during training. Seamless service. Anticipate needs without being seen. Quiet steps. Eyes down. Hands quick. Never ever speak unless you are directly spoken to. Your job is to make the guests feel like the only people in the world, which means you, for all intents and purposes, do not exist. But Maya hadn't always lived in the shadows. There was a time when her world had been an explosion of color, of texture, of sound. Osaka, Japan. Her mother had been a career diplomat, stationed at the U.S. consulate there for the better part of a decade. Maya had spent her most formative years there, from age 8 to 17. Her childhood wasn't one of concrete playgrounds and suburban anxieties. It was one of walking down cobbled temple paths in Nara, of feeding the bowing deer, of chasing cicadas through the blistering summer heat, of learning to fold 1,000 paper cranes in a quiet, sun-drenched classroom with children who never once made her feel like she didn't belong. She learned Japanese not as a subject, but as a language of belonging. She learned it before she learned the particular sting of American racism, before she learned to flinch at the weight of other people's low expectations, before she understood the exhausting performance of being the other. The language had become part of her, not just a set of words in her memory, but a part of her soul. She understood its nuances, the deep currents of respect and honor embedded in its very structure. She understood the bow, not just as a physical gesture, but as an act of lowering one's ego, of acknowledging the presence and worth of another. That world had been hers. Then came the sudden transfer back to the States after her mother's tour ended. Then came the culture shock in reverse. Then came the painful realization that her fluency in Japanese was treated as a fascinating party trick, something impressive coming from someone who didn't look the part. Her story wasn't seen as unique, but as confusing. Her intelligence was constantly being re-evaluated, second-guessed, because she didn't fit into the neat little boxes people had already prepared. Now, at 26, Maya was drowning in a sea of deferred dreams. She was juggling 2 soul-crushing service jobs to pay down a mountain of student loans from an undergraduate degree that felt increasingly useless. She was trying to save enough to get her master's degree in fine arts from a college in Brooklyn, a dream that felt further away with every passing month. She painted late at night in her tiny, cramped apartment, canvases filled with the vibrant colors of her memories of Japan. She sketched portraits of strangers on the subway, her hands moving with a grace and precision that no one at her job ever saw. She served wine and cleared plates with a quiet poise that came from knowing her own worth, even when she was the only one in the room who did. But tonight, watching Akira Tanaka endure the barrage of veiled insults and performative politeness, something dormant inside Maya began to stir. She didn't just see a quiet, powerful billionaire being tested. She saw a woman fighting the same silent, lonely war she had been fighting her whole life. She saw someone who possessed immense power, and yet was still being disrespected, still being diminished because of her accent, her gender, her nationality, her silence. And Maya knew that silence. Lord, did she know it. She had worn it like a suit of armor for years, but armor can be heavy. And tonight, watching these men chip away at another woman's dignity, Maya's armor was beginning to feel less like protection and more like a cage, and it was starting to crack. The conversation, if one could even call it that, had completely disintegrated. Richard had leaned back in his chair, drumming his manicured fingers on the polished table, his expression a mask of bored impatience, as if he were waiting for the opening act to get off the stage so the real show could begin. Akira sat perfectly still, a portrait of serene composure, answering each condescending question with a few precise words, delivered through her aide. Her silence was a steady, unyielding force, her tone impeccably respectful, But to the men across from her, it was a profound, maddening insult. Finally, Blake exhaled a loud, theatrical sigh, threw his linen napkin onto the table in a gesture of complete disgust, and leaned forward, his elbows on the table, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Look, we want to buy your company," he said, enunciating each word as if he were speaking to a particularly slow child. "Do you understand that?" Richard let out a short, sharp laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was a sound of dominance, a confirmation that he was in control. "Maybe we should have brought some flashcards," he added, his voice oozing with a condescension so thick Maya felt like she could taste it. Maya, standing by the service station pretending to polish a wine glass, nearly dropped it. Her back was to them, but she could feel their arrogance like a physical heat. Her fingers gripped the cool glass so tightly she was afraid it would shatter. It wasn't just the mockery that enraged her. It was the casual, brutal assumption that if someone didn't speak their language, on their terms, they were somehow less intelligent, less human. Akira blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. She didn't react. She didn't retaliate. But Maya saw it, a subtle shift in the air around her, as if the temperature in the room had dropped by 20 degrees. Blake, emboldened by her lack of response, smirked again. "I mean, seriously, Richard, is this a business negotiation or a fucking pantomime?" And then came the final blow, the one that would change everything. "I swear, man," Blake muttered to Richard, his voice low but perfectly audible to Maya, who stood not 5 feet away. "This is like trying to negotiate with a goddamn bonsai tree." Richard chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Silent, decorative," he added, "and probably older than it looks." Maya turned around, her movements slow and deliberate. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, clear fury. She glanced at Akira, whose face was still an unreadable mask of calm. But Maya saw it. She saw the infinitesimal tightening of her jaw. She saw the quiet storm gathering behind her eyes. This wasn't just business. This was personal. Just then, Maya felt a hand on her shoulder. It was her manager, Mr. Dubois. "Don't even think about it," he whispered, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "You speak when you're spoken to. You do your job. You are wallpaper, understand?" She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. But something inside her, some final dam of professional restraint, had already shattered. And then Akira spoke. It was just a phrase, in Japanese, not meant for her aide to translate. It wasn't for the men at the table. It was a whisper, a quiet exhalation of pain spoken almost to herself. Maya heard it as clearly as if it had been shouted. "Is there no one here who sees me?" And in that instant, Maya Jordan knew. This wasn't just cultural ignorance anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, systemic act of erasure. And she could not stay silent a second longer. The room had fallen into a strange, expectant stillness. Blake had leaned back, a smug look of satisfaction on his face, clearly pleased with his bonsai tree remark. Richard was pouring himself another generous finger of the Yamazaki, wearing the triumphant expression of a man who believed the deal was all but closed. The aide, ever the professional, sat in stoic silence. And Akira, she hadn't moved a muscle. But then, softly, she spoke again. Just one sentence. It wasn't for translation. It wasn't for the men. It was directed into the empty space between them all, as if she were casting her voice into a vast canyon, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, might hear an echo. Maya heard every single, heart-breaking syllable. "Watashi o hontou ni mite iru no wa, koko ni dareka imasu ka? Is there truly anyone here who sees me? The words didn't just strike Maya's ears. They struck a chord deep in her chest, a vibration of shared experience that was almost painful in its intensity. It wasn't just the meaning of the words. It was the profound ache behind them, the kind of deep, soul-level weariness that doesn't come from weakness, but from the immense strength it takes to be constantly erased, even when you're sitting in plain sight. Maya took a step back from the wall. For a brief, terrifying second, her hands trembled. She could feel the crushing weight of protocol, the iron grip of her training, the raw fear of being fired and losing the only income that stood between her and total financial collapse. Mr. Dubois' warning was still a hot brand on her ear. You are wallpaper. But that one sentence, those few soft, desperate words from Akira, made every rule she had ever been forced to follow feel unbearably small, unbearably wrong. She began to move toward the table. The quiet click of her sensible work shoes against the hardwood floor seemed to echo in the sudden, charged silence. Richard glanced up, his expression one of pure irritation at the interruption. Blake frowned, a look of confusion on his face. Her manager, standing near the door, froze in wide-eyed disbelief. Maya didn't stop. She approached Akira's side, and then she did something that shattered every rule of the establishment. She bowed. Low, not the shallow, perfunctory nod of a service worker, but the deep, formal, reverent bow of respect, a bow reserved for elders, for teachers, for sensei, a bow that acknowledged a person's presence, their history, their inherent weight in the world. When she slowly rose, she looked Akira Tanaka directly in the eye and spoke in the crisp, fluent Osaka-ben dialect of her childhood. Tanaka-sama, gomewaku o okake shite moshiwake arimasen. Kono yona burei ni chinmoku suru koto wa, sore jitai ga uragiri no katachi de aru to zonjimasu. Moshi yurushite itadakeru nara, watashi ga otetsudai dekimasu. Ms. Tanaka, I am deeply sorry to disturb you. I know I am not supposed to speak, but to remain silent in the face of this kind of disrespect is its own form of betrayal. If you will allow me, I can help. Richard's glass hit the table with a dull, heavy thud. Blake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The aide blinked, his professional mask finally cracking with undisguised shock. And Akira Tanaka's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in profound recognition. It was the look of a person stranded at sea for days, who, on the verge of giving up hope, finally sees the beam of a lighthouse cutting through the dense fog. She reached forward, her hand surprisingly warm, and gently touched Maya's arm. She whispered back in Japanese, her voice thick with an emotion that hadn't been there before. Watashi o mite kurete arigato. Thank you for seeing me. And just like that, with a few spoken words and a single act of courage, the entire balance of power in that 80-story monument to arrogance didn't just shift. It was utterly and irrevocably shattered. Maya Jordan hadn't just spoken out of turn. She had just changed everything. Akira leaned back in her chair, a subtle but significant change in her posture. For the first time that night, a measure of the immense strain she had been under seemed to lift from her shoulders. Her eyes, however, never left Maya's. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was more than permission. It was an anointing. It was an act of profound trust. Maya stepped forward, her spine straight as a steel rod. Her voice, now steady and clear, filled the cavernous room not with aggression, but with an unshakable current of clarity. Ms. Tanaka has requested that I translate for her moving forward, she said, her gaze sweeping over Richard and Blake, who were still gaping at her as if she had just sprouted wings. She believes it is time that you both understand the full and complete weight of what is being said. Blake let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. Sure, he stammered, trying to regain his footing. Whatever. Let's hear it. Maya turned back to Akira. They exchanged a brief, rapid-fire sentence in Japanese. It was measured, deliberate, a final confirmation of strategy. Then Maya turned back to the men, her posture radiating a confidence she didn't know she possessed. She would like to begin by discussing the revised contract you presented to her tonight. Richard, looking flustered, fumbled with his briefcase and slid a heavy, leather-bound folder across the polished table toward Maya. It's all in there, he said, his voice a little too loud. Clean, straightforward, more than generous. Maya opened the folder. She scanned the first few pages, her heart rate quickening, not from anxiety this time, but from a laser-like focus. She wasn't a corporate lawyer, but she had spent countless nights as a teenager helping her diplomat mother proofread complex international treaties and trade briefs. She knew how to recognize the deceptive architecture of language, clauses that sounded generous but were built like traps, with sharp, hidden edges. Her eyes landed on Section 7B. She paused. This clause, she said, her voice slow and methodical, gives Sterling Dynamics unrestricted and unilateral rights to renegotiate all existing intellectual property licenses post-merger. She looked up, her gaze locking onto Richard. That includes the foundational patents for the surgical AI that Ms. Tanaka personally developed over 15 years. Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. That's just standard merger language, a formality. Maya shook her head, a small, definitive gesture. No, she countered, her voice firm. Standard language requires mutual consent. This is intentionally vague. It's a loophole that allows you to sell off her most valuable patents to the highest bidder, stripping the core technology from Kirin Robotics without ever needing her approval. Blake waved a dismissive hand. It's just a safeguard, a contingency in case market dynamics shift post-acquisition. Maya didn't even grant him a glance. She kept flipping the pages, her fingers moving with purpose. Section 12, she announced, her tone sharpening, becoming more accusatory. This is a non-compete clause, but it's written so broadly, it wouldn't just prevent Ms. Tanaka from starting a new technology firm. She paused, letting the weight of her next words hang in the air. It would prevent her from consulting, from teaching at a university, from even speaking at a technology conference, for 10 years. She finally looked up, her eyes boring into them, stripping away their layers of expensive suits and unearned confidence. You're not just trying to buy her company, she said, her voice low and devastatingly clear. You are trying to systematically erase her from the very industry she helped to build. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. Richard's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. Blake muttered something incoherent under his breath. Their smug control, their absolute certainty, their entire world order, it was all slipping through their fingers like sand. And Akira Tanaka? She hadn't said another word. She didn't need to. Her face held the quiet, profound satisfaction of a grandmaster at chess, watching a brilliant, long-planned checkmate unfold, one perfect move at a time. Maya hadn't just translated words. She had cracked their code, sprung their trap, and now they were caught in the open, exposed for the entire world to see. The air in the room had gone dead still. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that precedes a storm. Blake fidgeted with a silver pen, clicking it open and shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Richard cleared his throat, his eyes darting towards the panoramic window, as if the glittering city lights might offer him an escape route. But there was no exit. The trap was sprung. Maya slowly closed the heavy contract folder. The sound was definitive, like a judge's gavel. And then, Akira spoke. This time her voice, though still soft, carried a new kind of authority, a new resonance. She gave a single, quiet instruction in Japanese to her aide. The man nodded once, without expression. From the inside pocket of his perfectly tailored blazer, the aide produced a small, sleek silver device, no larger than a deck of cards. He placed it gently in the center of the table, and, with a precise touch of his thumb, pressed a button. First, there was only the faint hiss of static. Then came Richard Sterling's voice, sharp, clear, and utterly damning. "Let's just cut the bullshit and get to the final offer. Cut out the incentive clauses for her executive team. We'll absorb her top engineers, offer them a slight bump. She'll be so lost in the translation process she'll never even know the difference." Blake Harrison's laugh followed, a sound full of arrogant teeth. "She's in her own little world, man. We can feed her team whatever narrative we want. The translator does all the heavy lifting. By the time she realizes we're gutting her R&D department, the ink will be dry and our guys will be in charge." The audio quality was pristine, a perfect recording of a conversation that had clearly taken place before the dinner began. It echoed off the expensive wood and glass of the private dining room, a ghost of their own treachery come back to haunt them. Maya didn't flinch. She felt it was her duty to deliver the final, killing blow. She translated the essence of what had been said, even though the meaning was already painfully, horrifically obvious. "They assumed she wouldn't understand," Maya said, her voice cold and steady as a surgeon's hand. "They joked about manipulating the terms behind her back. They laughed about silencing her executive team. They laid out a detailed plan to dismantle her life's work right in front of her, banking entirely on the assumption that her silence meant ignorance." Blake shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "You can't do that! You can't record private meetings without consent! That's illegal!" Maya turned to him, her gaze cool and unflinching. "So is corporate fraud." Richard remained seated, but all the color had drained from his face. He looked at Akira Tanaka. He truly looked at her for the very first time that night, and what he saw clearly terrified him. She wasn't a bonsai tree. She wasn't a decorative object. She was a fortress, and she had just lowered the drawbridge and unleashed her cannons. Akira didn't smile. She didn't need to. The recording clicked off with a final metallic finality. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was the silence of judgment, the silence of a verdict being delivered. Maya folded her hands in front of her, a picture of calm resolution. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of a prophecy. "You didn't just underestimate a woman," she said. "You underestimated the wrong woman, and you made the fatal mistake of forgetting that silence does not, and will never, mean surrender." This wasn't a business deal anymore. This was a demolition. And Akira Tanaka, with the help of the invisible woman no one had bothered to see, had just brought the whole corrupt structure crashing down. The heavy mahogany door slammed open with such force it rattled the crystal glasses on the service cart. Maya barely had time to turn before her manager, Mr. Dubois, stormed into the room. His face, usually a mask of cold, professional composure, was flushed with a deep, mottled red. Dubois was a man who communicated in raised eyebrows and clipped half-sentences, but not tonight. Tonight, he looked like a man who was seconds away from a coronary. "What in the hell was that?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. He stalked past the stunned, silent executives, ignoring Akira completely, his eyes fixed on Maya like a predator locking onto its prey. "You left your station. You inserted yourself into a private meeting. You spoke unbidden to a guest." Maya stood her ground. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She simply met his furious gaze. "You're done," he snapped, the words sharp as flint. "You're finished here, Jordan. I don't care what your pathetic excuse is. You're fired, effective immediately." From the table, Blake let out a short, bitter scoff. "Finally. Something this place gets right." Maya clenched her jaw, forcing her hands to remain steady at her sides. Inside, her chest was a bonfire of emotion. Not regret, but a sharp, heavy certainty. She had done the right thing. She knew it in her bones. And this apparently was the price. "Pack your things and get out," Dubois spat, his face inches from hers now. "Security will escort you from the premises." Maya was about to reply, though she wasn't sure what words would have come out. But she never got the chance. A deep, calm voice cut through the toxic atmosphere of the room. "Actually, she's not going anywhere." Every head in the room turned. Standing just inside the open doorway was a tall, impeccably dressed black man. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a clean-shaven head, and a gaze as calm and focused as a surgeon's in an operating room. He wore a simple navy suit that didn't scream for attention because it didn't need to. His presence alone commanded the room. "Elijah Vance," he said, his voice smooth and resonant as he stepped forward. "Executive Director of the North American Innovation Alliance, and, more relevant to tonight's discussion, one of the key financial partners behind Kirin Robotics' expansion into the United States." Dubois blinked, looking as though he'd been slapped across the face. Richard's face, if possible, turned an even deeper shade of gray. "I've been sitting in a booth in the main dining room for the past 20 minutes, Elijah continued, his movements slow and deliberate as he walked further into the room. "I was watching this entire disaster unfold. I listened to that illuminating recording, and I watched how each and every one of you behaved." His eyes, sharp and intelligent, locked on to Dubois. "You are not firing Maya Jordan tonight. In fact, if you know what's good for this establishment's reputation, you'll be issuing her a formal written apology." Dubois opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came out. Elijah then turned to Maya, and for the first time that entire grueling evening, she felt truly seen. Not as a uniform, not as a pair of hands, not as background scenery, but as a person of substance and value. "You," he said, his voice softening slightly, "were the only person in this room tonight who demonstrated a single shred of integrity." Maya's throat tightened, a knot of unshed tears and overwhelming relief, and the balance of power in the room shifted one last decisive time. Not because of money, not because of rank, but because one quiet voice had found the courage to speak the truth, and another, powerful voice had arrived to make damn sure the world was listening. The private dining room was quiet now. The air was still charged, but the suffocating tension had been replaced by a kind of stunned stillness. Mr. Dubois had backed away toward the door, his shoulders stiff with a humiliation that was almost painful to witness. Richard and Blake sat silently at the table, two deflated balloons of arrogance, their power utterly drained, their blustering confidence replaced by something that looked pitifully small. And Maya Jordan stood in the center of it all. Her black apron was still tied neatly around her waist, her posture was still as straight and poised as it had been at the start of her shift, but everything else about her had been transformed. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the woman who had single-handedly altered the course of a $900 million deal, not with a weapon, but with her voice and her quiet courage. Akira turned toward her. For the first time all night, the mask of unreadable composure fell away, and her expression softened into one of genuine warmth and profound respect. She spoke gently in Japanese, her words flowing not as a business tactic, but as a sincere expression of gratitude. Maya listened, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the words, feeling the weight of the last few hours begin to lift. She then turned to Elijah, translated softly, and gave a quiet nod of confirmation. Elijah stepped forward. "Ms. Tanaka has a proposition for you," he said, addressing Maya directly. "She would like to formally offer you a position on Kirin Robotics' global strategy team, not just as a cultural liaison, but as an executive aide, a senior advisor, someone who, in her words, understands the unspoken, and who knows how to listen to what is said between the lines." Maya blinked, certain she must have misheard him. The room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. "You'd be based here, in the new New York office," Elijah continued, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "You would help lead the U.S. expansion, advise on all future international partnerships, and oversee the creation of a new diversity and inclusion initiative within the company." He paused, letting the sheer weight of the offer settle in the quiet room. "Your outstanding student loans will be paid in full. Your tuition for any graduate program you choose anywhere in the world will be fully funded. You'll be provided with corporate housing near our new headquarters and a starting salary that reflects the immense value you have already proven you bring to the table." Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. The polished marble floor beneath her suddenly felt unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's life. This couldn't be happening. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not to art students drowning in debt and working 2 jobs. Akira stood up. She crossed the room slowly, gracefully, and came to a stop directly in front of Maya. She didn't offer a formal handshake. Instead, in a gesture of incredible warmth and solidarity, she reached out and took both of Maya's hands in her own. "You saw me," Akira said, her voice soft, her accented English clear and strong, "when no one else in this room did. You saw me." Maya could only nod, the words caught in her throat. "I would be honored," she finally managed to whisper. Truly, Akira Tanaka smiled, a real radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "Then come with us, Maya Jordan," she said. "We have work to do, real work." And just like that, the door that had been slammed in Maya's face her entire life wasn't just unlocked. It had been blown clean off its hinges. A future she had never even dared to dream of was waiting for her, and Maya Jordan, the invisible girl, was finally walking through it. The fallout was not just swift, it was biblical. Within 48 hours, the story of the disastrous negotiation at the Apex leaked. Not from Akira's camp, and not from Maya, but through the shadowy, lightning-fast back channels of the tech and finance worlds, which thrive on such spectacular implosions. The damning audio recording, shared discreetly with legal counsel and a few key institutional investors, quickly found its way into the hands of corporate oversight committees and, eventually, a few very hungry journalists. Sterling Dynamics' board of directors acted with the brutal efficiency of a body trying to amputate a gangrenous limb. Richard Sterling was asked to step down in a closed-door meeting that reportedly lasted less than 10 minutes. His multi-million-dollar golden parachute was unceremoniously shredded. By noon the next day, his name and photograph had been scrubbed from the company website. Blake Harrison resigned 2 days later, his official statement citing personal reasons. But the entire industry knew the truth. Investors panicked. Stockholders demanded an investigation. And the press? The press had an absolute field day. The narrative was too perfect, too potent to resist. 2 powerful, arrogant white executives, caught on tape plotting to manipulate and erase the legacy of a brilliant foreign female founder, are brought down by the one person they never saw coming, a young black waitress who simply chose to tell the truth. The headlines wrote themselves. From server to savior, the waitress who torpedoed a billion-dollar power grab, the quietest voice in the room, How Maya Jordan Changed Everything. The internet exploded. Social media comment sections hailed it as the ultimate act of poetic justice, a modern-day David and Goliath story. There was an outpouring of praise for Maya Jordan, for Akira Tanaka, and for the simple but profoundly radical act of refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. As for Richard and Blake, their careers were not just over, they were radioactive. The doors that had once swung open for them automatically were now bolted shut. Invitations to sit on boards and speak at industry conferences were quietly, politely withdrawn. Future business partnerships evaporated like mist in the morning sun. They had made the classic, fatal mistake of the arrogant. They had underestimated a woman's silence, and they had underestimated another woman's voice. And in doing so, they had reminded the entire world of a truth they had long since forgotten. Real power doesn't always wear a $3,000 suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. And sometimes, the very people you have trained yourself never to see are the ones who are about to change everything. This was never just a story about a corporate betrayal. It wasn't just a surprise twist in a high-stakes business deal. It was a story about visibility. It was a story about dignity. It's about what happens when the world automatically assumes that silence equals weakness, when it dismisses and devalues people based on how they look, where they come from, or the uniform they are forced to wear. Maya Jordan was never just a waitress. She was a young woman carrying the weight and wisdom of years of lived experience, a deep and nuanced understanding of another culture, and a quiet, formidable strength that most people were too blind to see. She saw what others refused to acknowledge. She heard what others chose to ignore. And when the moment of truth arrived, she chose courage over comfort. And Akira Tanaka, yes, she was a billionaire. But on that night, she was also a woman being spoken over, being patronized, being reduced to a harmful, one-dimensional stereotype. Her true power wasn't in her bank account. It was in her unshakable composure, her strategic discipline, and her profound wisdom to wait, not for the right deal, but for the right character to reveal itself. Both women were put in a room that tried to define and diminish them by their silence. But in the end, it was they who redefined the room and everyone in it. The truth is, most of us go through life not really seeing the people right in front of us. We see a job title. We see a uniform. We see a skin color. We see a language barrier. We assume, we categorize, we dismiss, and we move on. But the world can and does change in those rare, beautiful moments when someone stops and looks and truly, deeply listens. So here is the lesson. Here is the takeaway. Never, ever underestimate the quiet ones. Never ignore the person clearing your table, the person answering your call, the person stocking the shelves, or the person sitting silently at the far end of the conference table. You have no idea what worlds they contain, what knowledge they hold, or what they are capable of. And if you are one of those quiet ones, if you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been undervalued, if you have ever been overlooked, know this in your soul. Your voice matters. Your presence has weight. And one day, maybe when you least expect it, but when it counts the most, the world will finally hear you. This was a Black story. This was an Asian story. This was a woman's story. But it is also, and always, a human story. If this story meant something to you, if it resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone you've overlooked, or of a time when someone stood up for you, share it. Let this story ripple out. Let someone else who needs to hear it, hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, true stories that challenge the way we see the world and each other, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Because we are not done telling these stories. We are not even close.